His Majesty's Government's assessment of allegations of human rights abuses in China. The time limit is 1 hour. The Lord Bishop of St Albans.
My Lords, I approach this debate with a great deal of reticence, indeed almost reluctance. I've long admired China and the Chinese people, although one should acknowledge, of course, that the population of China is made up of 56 different ethnic groups, and I've long admired their ancient civilization. Not only is it a country of great natural beauty, but this is the nation which invented the compass, gunpowder, paper, movable type printing, kites and fireworks, silk, tea and porcelain, to name a few. Although I will perhaps omit noodles from my list of admirable inventions. My Chinese friends are among some of the most educated, industrious and cultured people I know. China is the 4th largest country by land mass and has the largest population of any country in the world. Over many decades, we've developed extensive trade links with China, and it's in their interests and in ours for us to share in commerce and to seek to find common cause for the good of the world. And yet, I feel I cannot remain silent in the face of such a wide range of human rights abuses. Now, lying behind our profound differences is a vast cultural gulf, which has been laid bare most recently for me reading President Xi's speech at the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party conference last month. I'd like to repeat a few lines from the President's speech. We will continue to take the correct and distinctively Chinese approach to handling ethnic affairs. We will remain committed to the principle that religions in China must be Chinese in orientation and provide active guidance to religions so they can adapt to socialist society. And a third quote, we have effectively contained ethnic separatists, religious extremists, and violent terrorists. To those here who are familiar with China's history of human rights abuses, they are worrying words. We've seen the tragedies of the distinctively Chinese approach to handling ethnic affairs in Xinjiang province, and before that, the Sinicization of Tibet. We've also seen the consequences of the Chinese government's direct influence on religion, and in fact it's on religion I'm going to focus most of my comments. I will say a few other things towards the end, and I know others will range more widely than I. Whether that be through the treatment of Uyghur Muslims by forced imprisonment and reportedly sterilisation, whether it's the Falun Gong or Chinese Christians. Similarly, characterising religious adherents as religious extremists has become the common part of the Chinese government's authoritarian approach. The Chinese state has persecuted many Christian leaders, particularly those who exemplify the values underpinning the Christian faith, such as the affirmation of the dignity of human life, opposition to tyranny, and a willingness to stand up for the persecuted. We've seen China's approach exemplified with the treatment of Joseph Zen, the 90-year-old cardinal who was arrested in May of this year for acting as a trustee to a humanitarian relief fund which helps some pro-democracy protesters. He is currently on trial. Many commentators have described it as a show trial where he will almost certainly be convicted. I asked the minister what discussions has His Majesty's government had with China regarding the release of Cardinal Zen. The events in Hong Kong over recent years have led to large numbers of citizens leaving to come here to the UK, and incidentally I'd like to pay tribute to His Majesty's government for the way that that's been handled and is being handled. I'm hugely grateful for that. I've met a good number of Hong Kongers who are now living in my diocese. Quite a number of them have joined our churches, and many of them are making a wonderful contribution to our national life already. Over the summer, a very old friend who'd been working in Hong Kong for a number of years contacted me because he felt it so oppressive and he felt so restrictive and felt he really had to get out of the country very quickly. He came and stayed with me for about 4 months as he was getting his affairs sorted out. He told me Hong Kong had become so oppressive because of the high levels of surveillance. He was telling me how he couldn't even go to church without being filmed and recorded. It no longer felt safe. This treatment is not just limited to Christians, but indeed anyone who is not prepared to align their faith with the aims and objectives of the Communist Party of China. This has meant the detention of imams, the demolition of mosques, and in some cases situations where people have been sent to psychiatric hospitals for challenging the Chinese government's decision to demolish their religious buildings. In Yunnan province, in the south of China, the Chinese government's Religious Affairs Bureau has banned children from attending church with their parents. They've installed surveillance cameras outside churches to detect any children during Sunday services. They've frozen churches' bank accounts and removed crosses forcibly. Article 300 of the Chinese Criminal Code prohibits the organisation of any religion deemed a heterodox teaching. This law is being used to restrict freedom of religion and belief across China. In 2015, this article was revised to include life imprisonment as one optional punishment for participating in any unsanctioned religious group. In the last few years, we've seen Chinese Christians and Falun Gong practitioners arrested, detained, and persecuted for practicing their faith, sometimes even when they were only practicing it in their own homes. Again, I would reiterate that the words of President Xi Jinping last month are an explicit endorsement of measures against individuals and faith groups. I'd like to ask the Minister to tell us what His Majesty's Government assessment is of these laws and what steps we can take to support people of faith who are being persecuted by the Chinese state. Now, as I've chosen to address most of my comments on the subject of religious persecution in China, this is certainly only the tip of the iceberg, and I know other noble lords will range more widely over other human rights abuses. But we all know that China continues to use the death penalty, in some cases for non-violent or political offences, and fails to produce any official statistics about numbers. According to some groups, China has executed around 8,000 people a year since 2007, which, it is estimated, accounts for around 90% of global total worldwide executions. Additionally, China has had a well-catalogued history of using political psychiatric abuse against dissidents, sending critics of the regime to psychiatric hospitals under the pretense they are mentally ill. In these institutions, individuals are subject to beatings, forced medication, electroconvulsive therapy, and repeated incarceration. My lords, I'm not going to say too much more because others will be able to set out the problems. So I'd like to end by asking the noble Lord the Minister for his assessment of these allegations against the Chinese state and to hear what representations His Majesty's government have made to the Chinese government.
My lords, the whole House is indebted to the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, for the, as always, exemplary way in which he's spoken to the House today and introduced today's debate, and for focusing our attention again on the CCP human rights violations. I declare my non-financial interest in the register. My lords, the report of the International Relations and Defence Select Committee on China, Trade and Security describes UK-China policy as lacking strategic coherence, confusion reinforced this week at the G20 summit. During the leadership election, Rishi Sunak said, and I quote, that for too long Western leaders had rolled out the red carpet and turned a blind eye to the CCP's nefarious activities and ambitions. Liz Truss upgraded the UK's recognition of China from systemic competitor to threat, as have our allies in the United States, and described China's actions in Xinjiang as genocide. But on Tuesday, Mr Sunak was no longer citing the words of the Director General of MI5 that China represents, quote, the biggest long-term threat to Britain and the world's economic and national security, preferring instead to describe the CCP regime as a challenge. My lords, North Korea, Iran and Russia are all described by the FCDO as a threat. Why is China not to be described in the same way? Yesterday, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, a former leader of the party, warned the Prime Minister that, and I quote, it now looks like we're drifting into appeasement with China. There's an old saying that when you want to understand something, you should follow the money. We've been spending literally billions of pounds in China, ratcheting up, of course, a trade deficit of some £40 billion. We've seen British taxpayers' money being spent on goods made in a state that uses slave labour to undercut its competitors and is credibly accused of genocide. But, my lords, we've now added insult to injury. On November the 15th, earlier this week, Will Quince MP confirmed in the House of Commons that the government is spending £770,000 a day to store 120 million items of PPE in China. I repeat, £770,000 a day. That's more than £280 million a year. Think of how that could be used to fund nurses' salaries, patient care, any number of public services, or the promotion of human rights. Perhaps the Noble Lord the Minister will tell us how much has been spent in total so far and explain how much longer we'll go on paying these exorbitant sums to the CCP regime. And what does all this say, my lords, about national resilience and dependency? Haven't we learned anything from Germany's dependency on Putin and the consequences of indebtedness? Drifting back to the Cameron-Osborne golden era would be a huge error. It would be a betrayal of all those who suffer at the hands of the CCP, persecuted religious minorities, journalists and human rights defenders, those who've had the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and association suppressed. It would be a betrayal, my lords, of all those driven out of their homes in Hong Kong and welcomed, and I agree with the Right Reverend Prelate, they have been welcomed, I think, again, in an exemplary way by Her Majesty's government to the United Kingdom. And also, though, think of the betrayal of the 50 million victims of the CCP. The Italian scholar Massimino Itravigni says, and I quote, that no organisation in human history killed more human beings than the CCP. My question to the Minister is, what's changed in the extremely short period between Liz Truss leaving and Rishi Sunak arriving at number 10 that justifies this U-turn in relation to China? Have the atrocities against the Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities been stopped and proven to be untrue? Has Hong Kong seen a restoration of democracy? And are Ben Wallace's recent remarks on Taiwan to the International Relations and Defence Select Committee part of this new rapprochement? He said, in answer to a question from me, it is in China's plan to reunify Taiwan to mainland China. It's not a secret. Britain wants a peaceful process towards that. My lords, the 23 million people of Taiwan have never been part of the PRC. Why should we aid and abet that process? Why should we suggest that there's something inevitable about this? Since when has that been an object being pursued by His Majesty's government? On Monday, I chaired a meeting here in the House addressed by Bill Browder and young Hong Kongers. Pleas were made for Magnitsky sanctions against those who've abused human rights, upended democracy, subverted institutions, corrupted the rule of law. Political show trials in Hong Kong have become the norm under the new national security regime, with the verdict of Jimmy Lai's so-called fraud trial coming next week, as well as the verdict of the trial of the 90-year-old Cardinal Zen, referred to by the Right Reverend Prelate, and the other trustees of the 612 Humanitarian Relief Fund. Given the growing number of political prisoners in Hong Kong and upcoming national security cases, including that of Jimmy Lai and Apple Daily journalists on the 1st of December, will the noble Lord tell the House what the government is willing to do to stand by its legal, moral and historic commitments to Hong Kong and to Jimmy Lai, who is, after all, a United Kingdom citizen? How does the Minister respond to my noble and learned friend, Baroness Hale, former President of the Supreme Court, who has warned in the last 24 hours of Hong Kong's unacceptable laws and said that British judges should search their consciences and vacate their seats in the Hong Kong courts? And what of the CCP's subversion of international jurisprudence and international bodies? Only a few weeks ago, we saw how the CCP can silence the very UN body that was tasked with accommodating dialogue about human rights violations, the United Nations Human Rights Council, of which they are a member, rather like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. On the 6th of October, the Human Rights Council rejected a proposal, of which the UK was a co-sponsor, to even have a debate on Michel Bachelet's findings that, I quote, there had been serious human rights violations, potentially including crimes against humanity, against the Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim communities, which may have been committed in Xinjiang. The proposal was defeated, 19 votes to 17, with China's position supported by those other great champions of human rights, Eritrea, Pakistan, Sudan and Cameroon. Study the links and note that many of those opposing a debate, even a debate, have a substantial Belt and Road indebtedness to the CCP. How do we intend to take this issue forward? My Lords, are we intending to table a resolution at the General Assembly of the United Nations? And closer to home, when can we expect the Manchester police report on the assault of Bob Chan, whom I've met, and the other protesters outside the city's Chinese consulate? What is the Foreign Secretary doing to take action to protect the very rights now denied in Hong Kong, including reports that the CCP are establishing overseas police stations in the United Kingdom? At a meeting earlier this morning, I learned of the harassment of Hong Kong students by mainlanders in Edinburgh and indeed other universities. What are we doing to protect the human rights of the Hong Kongers who have settled here? And following the welcome decision yesterday on security grounds to prevent the takeover of our biggest producer of semiconductors at Newport Wafer Fab, what assessment has the Minister and the Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, made of the ambitions to create a mega PRC embassy on the site of the Royal Mint? My Lords, will the noble Lord agree to talk to Mr Tugendhat and to ask Michael Gove to consider calling in this application? This deal led to 200 British citizens having the freehold of their homes sold to the Chinese state over their heads. After what happened in Manchester and what happens throughout China, families are scared, angry, and have been utterly ignored. My Lords, will the noble Lord write to me detailing who brokered the Royal Mint deal, how much money passed hands, and what was the independent valuation of the value of the site? If the noble Lord, the Minister, who is always so kind and generous in dealing with the questions that I put to him, but if he can't undertake to answer them today, will he at least agree that these are legitimate questions, they deserve to be answered, and that he will write to me about them? My Lords, I close once again in thanking the Right Reverend Prelate for giving us the opportunity to say some of these things.
Yeah. My Lord, I also congratulate the noble Lord, the Lord Bishop of St Albans, for securing this important and indeed most timely debate. I declare an interest as the co-chair of the British Taiwanese All-Party Parliamentary Group. My Lords, China has been back in the global spotlight this week with the attendance of the Chinese President Xi at the G20 summit in Indonesia. It had been hoped by Downing Street at least that this gathering would include a meeting between the Chinese President and our own Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The first encounter between a UK Prime Minister and the Chinese head of state since 2018. Indeed, Number 10 briefed journalists, and I quote, that Mr Sunak would encourage China to use its place in the global stage responsibly to resolve geopolitical tensions, ensure regional stability, and play its part in tackling the devastating global impact of the war in Ukraine. In the end, my Lords, the meeting did not take place because of the terrible missile incident in Poland. My Lords, that was unfortunate, as indeed was the missile incident. because I would have welcomed Mr. Sunak's feedback following the meeting with his Chinese counterpart. I cannot recall a United Kingdom Prime Minister ascending to power with so little known about his stance on many foreign policy issues. His position in the Northern Ireland Protocol falls into that category, given that the protocol came about as part of an international agreement. An answer I received to a written parliamentary question last week unfortunately did not fill me with any great faith about my Prime Minister's expertise on the protocol, since it advised us that Mr. Sunak failed to visit Northern Ireland even once during his tenure as Chancellor of the Exchequer. However, my Lords, that is a subject for another day. In relation to China, your Lordships will be aware of my long-standing support for the Taiwanese people and my steadfast opposition to the aggressive stance the Chinese state continues to adopt towards them. Your Lordships will be equally conscious of my deep frustration with the weak position held by the conveyor belts of UK Prime Minister, who, with the exception of Liz Truss, as Lord Alton has mentioned, have failed to truly stand up to the Beijing bullying boys over Taiwan. At least Ms. Truss can claim some form of legitimacy on this particular issue. My Lords, it is not just our Prime Ministers who have provided wriggle room for Chinese aggression. As Lord Alton also mentioned, giving evidence to the International Relations and Defence Committee of the House earlier this month, the United Kingdom Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, a man for whom I generally have utmost respect, said this, and I quote, "This is in China's plan to reunify Taiwan to mainland China. This has been its 50-year plan, or whatever the plan is called, and so it is not a secret. Britain wants a peaceful process towards that." My Lords, I have to say that this is a statement which surely gave President Xi and his coterie rubbing their hands with glee in China. In contrast, I have no doubt that these words had the opposite effect on the good people of Taiwan, holding their heads in despair and indeed fear. My Lords, the topic of today's debate is human rights abuses in China. And the world is gaining greater awareness of the appalling crimes committed by the Chinese Communist Party and the regime against the Uyghur Muslims, including killings, mass detentions, torture, forced mass sterilisation, and cultural persecution. The United States has accurately described China's treatment of these people as genocide, with the Belgian, the Canadian, the Czechoslovakian, Lithuanian and Dutch parliaments passing resolutions accusing the Chinese government of committing genocide against them. My Lords, so too has the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament, when a motion approved in the other place this year, resolved the Uyghurs and other ethnic religious minorities are suffering crimes against humanity and genocide. But startlingly, my Lords, when this is the opinion of our Parliament, unfortunately it is not the formal view of Her Majesty's government, which indeed has held steadfastly to the position that should not make determinations in relation to genocide. My Lords, I warmly welcome my noble friend Lord Elton to his place this afternoon for bringing forward his private member's bill, which would enable the High Courts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland and the Court of Sessions in Scotland to make preliminary determinations as to what constitutes genocide in accordance with the UK's obligation under the Genocide Convention. I would urge your Lordships to give my noble friend's bill your full support. I certainly you will have mine. My Lords, failing to stand up to state-led aggression, sabre-rattling, and worse, has terrible consequences, as the brave people of Ukraine are experiencing each and every day. Russia invaded Ukraine because President Putin believed he could get away with it. I hold the same fears about the President Young's attitude towards Taiwan. My Lords, I conclude my remarks by referring back to the Defence Secretary's publicly stated view that Her Majesty's government is seeking a peaceful process towards Taiwanese reunification with China. And I put two direct questions to the Noble Lord the Minister, with whom I have the highest regard. Who has been handed the difficult task this afternoon of responding to this debate? Firstly, knowing what we know about the ongoing Chinese human rights abuses, why, in his view, would the Taiwanese people want to be part of a state that can commit such heinous crimes against so many of its own people? They are freedom-loving people who will have no say in this. And secondly, Minister, why would our country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, wish to be in any way complicit with further crimes of accession to what effectively would be a Chinese annexation of Taiwan? My Lords, I would like to think that we as a nation are better than that. It is just a shame that the UK government, the current UK government, appears not to agree. My Lords, I look forward to the Noble Lord the Minister's reply.
For the Noble Lord Rogan, and I will obviously touch on Taiwan in a moment, and I commend the work that he does in the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Taiwan, of which I'm a very proud member. He did seek to give us a little bit of a detour to Belfast away from Beijing, which I admire him for squeezing that in, but I think after 4 long days of committee on the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the Noble Lord the Minister will be relieved that I'm not asking him about this, although I did ask on a number of occasions what the Prime Minister's views on the Northern Ireland Protocol were. The Right Reverend Prelate is to be commended for bringing this debate. He shouldn't have had any reluctance or reticence for bringing this debate to the committee, because it is of profound importance for the future of our country. As the Noble Lord Alton had indicated, we debated in committee the International Relations and Defence Committee's report on China on the 20th of October. The Noble Lord Alton is an esteemed member of that committee, and I had served on it. And he was absolutely right to say that we were challenging the void in the government strategy on China. And indeed, it was that terminology of the committee report itself which highlighted a void. And when it comes to the very serious issues such as Taiwan, it is not simply the UK's foreign relations with Taiwan that is of significance. It is the UK's strategic interest with Taiwan as a very major trading partner, of which we are reliant on technological imports from Taiwan, as well as a very significant export partner for some of our key export sectors. Therefore, the consequences of what will happen between the relationship between the PRC and Taiwan is of direct UK interest. Not only that, it is also a soft power interest. When I visited on one of my, and I've been to Taiwan on a number of occasions, on one of my visits, I was there with our former colleague, my noble friend, Lord Steele. When we met with President Tsai Ing-wen, she said that it was Lord Steele, as leader of the Liberal Party, that inspired her to be involved in politics in Taiwan, because she was studying at the LSE at the time. And it is the fact that Taiwan and the UK relations both are very strong and deep views of the principles of democracy and rights is of so great importance. And therefore it is an appropriate prism through which to look at UK relations with China and on human rights and of its increasingly aggressive posture. I join with the Right Reverend Prelate in saying that the relations between the people of the UK and the people of China is of very deep and significant importance. And you cannot go to a campus, you cannot speak to a business, you cannot go to a high street and not see that depth of relationship. But of course, that, as our previous debate when we were debating our relations with India, it doesn't mean that we should be blind to some of the very serious challenges that exist. It was interesting, having reviewed the government's integrated review, but also the Minister's response to the Select Committee. And I In the context of that, I read the US Department of Defense National Defense Strategy, which has recently been published, which now refers to the PRC, highlighting its increasing provocative rhetoric and coercive activity towards Taiwan, with the risk of destabilizing, risk miscalculation and threatening the peace and stability, but also China's other areas of an ability of using cyber and digital technology. The US are now considering the PRC as therefore the pacing challenge for the department. So the United States and its security review now see that as what, as it terms, the pacing challenge. But of course, at the very same time as where the Noble Lord Alton is right, it is confusing, to say the least, as to what the UK posture is. In the debate that we had on the committee, I asked where the status of the China strategy was, because the government previously had said that it was held by the National Security Council. Then that was a council that was then abolished. Now it apparently has been recreated under the Prime Minister. But it's interesting that the government says, that they've recreated the National Security Council, where Lord Goldsmith told me that it hadn't been abolished in the first place. So that is just a microcosm of the lack of clarity as to where we are. But of course, the seriousness with regards to this is that the UK, in many of our key sectors, both highlighted by the Director General of I5, by myself and many debates that we've had on trade policy and elsewhere, we are vulnerable to being in key sectors overly reliant on imports from China, and the dependency is of a worry. This is in the absence of there being a strategic industrial strategy for the UK, which reviews digital, e-commerce, privacy, intellectual property, and supply chain resilience, as well as looking at some of our key areas. One area that we had raised in the past, which is about wafer technology. We were told repeatedly, when the government refused to call in purchase, that there was no concerns. Then after, I think, parliamentary pressure, the government did call it in, and the news this week is broadly welcome. But that highlights the fact that it doesn't seem as if the Business Department and the Treasury and the FCDO are working in complete alignment. And the fact that we now have, and I raised a number of months ago, last year, the fact that we have the biggest trade deficit on goods imports for any country in a nation's history. It was over 40.5 billion. That's declined slightly, but it's only declined by £2 billion. So we now have a trade deficit with China of £39 billion on imports. And that means that we do need an industrial strategy and a resilience review across the key sectors. It also means that we should be looking at screening investments of UK firms in some of those key sectors within China itself. The recent reports that the German government are operating this should be an indication that we need to do the same. The reason why I ask this is because in the very latest trade figures with China, published on the 2nd of November, it highlighted 20% increase in UK investment in China and Chinese enterprises, including state-owned enterprises. So I simply don't know what the government's strategy is when we hear from the Noble Lord Alton what the new Prime Minister had said, and now it's represented in the growth of investments within these enterprises. The final thing I would raise with regards to Hong Kong, as well as where the UK, I don't think the government has moved fast enough or far enough, is a review of what state-owned, both party leaders within Hong Kong as well as state-owned enterprises, what property assets they have in London and in the UK, what individuals have them, how transparent that is, and how much they are investment within UK investment funds. I have raised repeatedly that those agreements that were signed by David Cameron and President Xi in 2015, I've raised as to whether any of them have been reviewed because they offer increased UK market access to Chinese enterprises, including investment in pension funds in the UK. I don't know whether state-owned enterprises, party leaders, or those that have either been directly linked with or complicit in human rights abuses in China are increasing their purchases of British pension funds. Local authorities, individuals, and investors need to know, and it's the government's responsibility to tell us. So part of all of this, we do need a China strategy as well as a resilience, because we cannot simply bemoan human rights abuses in China if we are silent at home.
My Lord, I welcome and thank the Right Reverend Prelate for initiating this debate. One thing I'm certain of is in a 1-hour QSD we're not going to be able to address all the issues that we need to address. But nevertheless, I think this debate is a very good agenda-setting point where we can sort of focus the direction we think we should go on. And one point I would emphasise that the Right Reverend Prelate mentioned in his introduction is that not only how important the people of China are and how important their history and tradition and culture is to the world, but without China's engagement and cooperation, we will not be able to address the global challenges that we face, particularly climate change and pandemics. Global health, a critical issue for us all. But as the Noble Lord, Lord Alton highlighted, the IRDC report on China set out quite clearly that the government's approach has too often reflected a strategic incoherence. And as the Noble Lady Baroness Anley said as chair in the recent debate that we've had, which the Noble Lord Purvis has also highlighted, in that debate, she said it was unclear how the government intended to balance human rights issues with its economic relationship with China, and how it will prioritise when these considerations clash. Now, I think the Noble Lord Purvis, and we raised it in that debate, well, where does the strategy sit? Who's got responsibility? Certainly when the Minister replied to the chair of the committee, the strategy was being dealt with, but it was through the National Security Council, etc., etc. But the simple fact is that what we need is not just about government policy, and what was highlighted by that report is that all sections of our society need to be aware of how to react and deal with these things. Business, civil society, trade unions. And one of the things that I feel very concerned about is that the government have a good record, particularly on supply chain issues and certainly modern slavery. And I've raised with the Noble Lord on previous occasions, promises to strengthen that seem to be made, but no follow-through is taken. There's no action. I want to know from the Noble Lord today what his department is doing to engage with business and civil society in the question of modern slavery and supply chains, because that's a critical issue about how we trade with China. Because no one's suggesting we can stop trade with China. Apart from anything else, the Noble Lord Alton's highlighted how big that trade is. And it's not about trade agreements, and it's not about some of the clauses in trade, that we've managed to put into legislation about trade agreements. This is about procurement and how we actually help businesses deal with this issue. And I think it's really important. The Noble Lords have raised it quite, this is a cross-departmental issue. We have the FCDO making very clear positive statements, the Department of International Trade saying the complete opposite, and other Westminster departments, and that's why we need a coherent strategy. And we've got the pieces in place. They just need to be joined up. And of course, what the noble Lord Orton has raised. And by the way, I want to pay tribute to him. He's been consistent in raising these issues, and not only, he has suffered. The Chinese Communist Party has decided to sanction him, a parliamentarian, for raising these issues, and we should make note of that. But of course, our focus has been particularly on the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which face a brutal campaign of oppression. But the Right Reverend Prelate has raised other issues, particularly religious minorities. But I want to focus on Xinjiang. The UN has said that this may constitute crimes against humanity. And of course, we know the House of Commons has voted to recognise as genocide. So it's very clear we must have stronger action from the government. So can the Noble Lord highlight not only the actions that we've taken at the UN, but what are we doing in terms of imports from Xinjiang? What are we doing about a potential ban on cotton that we know is produced by slave labour? I think it's really important. I mean, many of my noble friends in the Chamber have raised how we can actually address that issue more effectively. But it does require a firm, strong, consistent approach. And it's not just linked to one region, of course. And we've also raised, and we've had successes with the government about the disgusting issue of human organ farming, which, in a civilized world that we think we are in, the fact that this is going on, and the fact that it's not restricted to China, the products are being exported all over the place, and people are going to China to get access to some of these organs, and we need a much stronger approach. And of course, while sanctions have an important role to play in responding to the most serious instances of human rights abuses, we must also utilise our influence at the UN to raise these violations. And I know the Noble Lord, the Minister, is the Minister for United Nations, and as the Noble Lord Orton raised, the vote at the Human Rights Council, which rejected a resolution to hold a debate on China's violations in Xinjiang. And I am, of course, pleased that the United Kingdom supported that resolution, and let's acknowledge it. And I know the Noble Lord will no doubt come back and say, yes, we pushed it and we supported it and we encouraged others to vote for it. But what are we going to do next is what I want to hear from the Minister. Can he say what our mission will do to secure a further debate on it, particularly at the General Assembly? And we're often focused on, the limitations of the UN, but we should also see, and I know the Noble Lord agrees with me, that it is an opportunity to enter into discussions with a wide range of companies, particularly those that have been influenced through China, and we should be building those alliances in a much more coherent and stronger way. And of course, we must be alert to human rights abuses caused by China's elsewhere, and Noble Lords have raised Hong Kong and the attack on international agreements, the attack on commitments that were made to the people of Hong Kong, and certainly our response to that. And I would hope the Noble Lord, the Minister, could tell us what assessment the government have made of those further attacks on civil liberties since the flawed election of John Lee. And I know the response will be, well, I'm not going to discuss future designations for sanctions. But I think what we want to hear is that we are going to take those abuses seriously, and we will act and use the powers that we've now got under the human rights sanctions, that we will be looking at how they can be addressed effectively. I hope the Noble Lord will be able to respond to all of the contributions and give us an assurance that we will be more consistent in standing up for human rights across China.
My Lords, may I thank every Noble Lord who's taken part in this debate, but in particular the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of St Albans, for tabling this very important debate, and again for the deep expert insights that we've had on the debate today on the issue of human rights within China. As the UK Human Rights Minister in particular, I welcome this amplification and the continued spotlight on this particular issue. On a personal note, it certainly strengthens my hand in discussions that I have with colleagues across government, and it's important that we continue to raise these issues because, put it simply, it matters. We've had 2 debates today on this issue, and it is right that we continue to have focus and, again, holding the government to account on what more it can be doing in this respect. The Right Reverend Prelate and indeed the Noble Lord Purvis drew important focus to the people-to-people links between China and the United Kingdom, and that's perhaps uniquely for the United Kingdom and arguably the United States, 2 countries that find themselves quite unique, that quite often when we talk about international affairs we have reflective domestic insights as well, and it's important that the Chinese culture, communities and most importantly people are very vital to the vibrancy, diversity and strength of the United Kingdom as British citizens here. And indeed I acknowledge and thank the Right Reverend Prelate and the Noble Lord Alton for their kind remarks on the B&O policy and the United Kingdom government. But I would add in particular to both the Right Reverend Prelate and in particular the Noble Lord Alton that their advocacy is equally important because it brings that focus and attention on these issues. And I recall that those particular debates and discussions, and where at times I can't answer fully because we are restricted by some of the sensitive discussions, but they did act as a real catalyst for ensuring the joint-up thinking and working with our colleagues very closely, and the then Home Secretary, to who I also pay tribute, for ensuring that the processes were put in place, that we did offer that warm welcome to people who wanted to come to the United Kingdom for the right reasons. And that continues to be the case with the B&Os. Turning to the important issue of human rights and the human rights violation, can I from the start, and I was listening very carefully on some of the trade issues, if I may say, to the Noble Lord Purvis and others, I will sort of consult with my colleagues in the Department of International Trade and write in that respect, as I will on the couple of questions on the property in particular and the site that the Noble Lord Alton raised. But I can say this, that I will go through some of the measures that I know we have taken, and of course where we can amplify further measures that have been taken. And I also subscribe to what the Noble Lord Collins said on the issue of supply chain, that it's right that the government has made these statements, but we also need to go into the detail to ensure what that impact is. And we know sanctions policies can be circumvented, sanctions can be circumvented, and it's important when we act, as we've done in the case of Xinjiang, that we do so in concert with our key partners to also ensure there's a consistent approach in this respect. If I may, turning to the situation in China, China's ongoing human rights violations include in Xinjiang. Let's not forget Tibet, that's not come up specifically, as well as the erosion of rights and freedoms as we've heard in Hong Kong. But taking Xinjiang first, the evidence and scale of the severity of human rights violations being perpetrated against the Uyghur Muslims is frankly, and I state quite deliberately, a harrowing picture in every sense. On the 31st of October, and Noble Lords will know, certainly I've discussed this with the Noble Lord Collins and the Noble Lord Alton, we were long-standing and indeed long-standing advocates in my bilateral meetings with the then High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, to ensure that her visit did happen. And yes, it was a managed visit, but I think the report that she produced was very telling in terms of the detail, and we welcomed the fact that the report happened. And of course, as Noble Lords have pointed out, the Noble Lord Collins, Noble Lord Purvis and others, on the issue of the vote that happened, just on the procedural motion. In the end, the actual tallying figures, after there was a small discrepancy, it was actually by one vote. It was 2019, but nevertheless, it shows the strength of Chinese influence on influencing, ironically, members of the Human Rights Council. And this is not part of my formal script here, but I will say it because it needs to be on the record. It is an extreme disappointment that where you see the biggest internment of the Muslim community anywhere in the world, we do not see the Islamic world, the Muslim countries themselves, standing up for that. And it sort of, when issues of Islamophobia are raised with me, and we do have challenges on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the United Kingdom, it does sort of immediately throw a spotlight back that the issues of discrimination and the total internment of Uyghurs is, frankly, there's a deafening silence. But I assure Noble Lords, it's an issue that is very close to my heart, and I continue to raise those bilaterally with a number of countries. The report itself sets out a range of evidence, including first-hand accounts from victims of arbitrary, discriminatory detention, torture, sexual and gender-based violence, violations of reproductive rights, destruction of religious sites. And perhaps most notably, the report also states that the extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detentions of members of Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim groups, and I quote here, may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. And that's a very damning but factual assessment on what was a limited visit by the then Human Rights Commissioner. The report also corroborates the growing evidence that we have on China's human rights violations in the region. My Lords, whilst the recent focus on Beijing's violations have been on Xinjiang, there are of course a number of other long-standing human rights issues in China. In particular, I would note the issues around and the situation in Tibet, the issues, as Noble Lords have mentioned, about the freedom of religion or belief, and the reports of Tibetan parents being coerced and intimidated in sending their children to state boarding schools. We also are focused, and I acknowledge fully from the Noble Lord Alter and the Right Reverend Prelate, indeed all Noble Lords, and Lord Rogan also raised the issue of persecutions, not just of the Uyghur Muslims, but of Christians, of Buddhists, the Falun Gong practitioners and others, on the grounds simply of their religion or belief. I was humbled yet honoured to host the Freedom of Religion or Belief Conference earlier this year, but a conference alone will not resolve the issues, nor will this debate, as the Noble Lord Collins, but it's important the focus remains. Regrettably, we've also seen ongoing Chinese assaults on Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms. The national security law, which we've debated through questions and debates in your Lordship's House, has and continues to be systematically used to restrict rights and freedoms and silence dissenting voices. The authorities' decision to target leading pro-democracy figures for prosecution in Hong Kong is unacceptable. Hong Kong's way of life, prosperity and stability relies on respect of fundamental freedoms, rights and freedoms. And let's be clear once again, China undertook itself to uphold as a co-signatory of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and it is protected in Hong Kong's basic law. It's their law, something the Chinese government, the Chinese state signed up to, and it should be upheld. This is an internationally agreed statement which is lodged also with the United Nations. Now, Noble Lords raised a number of points just on the issue, first of all, on Cardinal Zen, Jimmy Lai and Andy Lee. Let me assure all Noble Lords that the United Kingdom has spoken repeatedly and will continue to about China's arbitrary arrests and prosecutions in Hong Kong, including on the names that I have mentioned. And where trials are taking place, we also have consular attendance, and I will of course keep Lords updated in this respect. Noble Lords also raised...
Minister, before he leaves that really important point about the way the judiciary has been subverted in Hong Kong, he will have seen the remarks of our noble learned friend Baroness Hale reported in today's newspapers. Can he respond to that, whether the government supports her views that jurists should search their consciences before they participate in such proceedings?
Before the Lord replies, just remind members that she only do one intervention and one speech in a QSD.
My Lords, I'll cover that in the note specifically, but I think the principle we've seen about the importance of jurists to see are they able to fulfil their obligations in the way that they're designed to within the construct which has been set up. So I certainly, as I said, in principle, that's something I'm certainly agree with in terms of how jurists, it's their decision, of course, ultimately, but it's important that they, and I know very able jurists will ask themselves that question of themselves as well. Very quickly to pick up on some specific questions. If I may, just on the issue of the Prime Minister's position, which was raised several times. First and foremost, he has set out that the view that China are both a systematic competitor, and I'm quoting here from something I believe he said at the G20 meeting in Bali recently, that they're also the biggest state-based threat to our economic security. Now, I know there's been different perspectives, but I know of our long-standing commitment to Taiwan. Recently, my right honourable friend, the Trade Minister, also visited Taiwan, as noble lords will be aware, and the UK's long-standing position on Taiwan has not changed. Whilst we do not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, we have a strong unofficial relationship based on growing ties in a wide range of areas, including trade. And we share the common values of democracy, which Taiwan also propagate. And we do not support any unilateral attempts to change the status quo. And I've often said in your Lordship's House, it is a matter of both sides on the Taiwan Straits to address these particular issues. I know there have been a number of other points raised, which I've noted as statements made to committees, etc., by colleagues of mine within the government. Of course, I haven't seen the full details of that, so it would be remiss of me not to respond, but I will do so once I have time to review those. My Lords, turning very briefly, as the Noble Lord Collins said about UK action, of course we continue to work within the context of the UN. I mentioned the Human Rights Council. We also, last month, at the UN's Third Committee, supported the latest joint statement on China's human rights violation in Xinjiang, following a concerted effort with our partners, the UK's network of embassies, high commissions, a record 50 countries representing 6 continents actually supported that statement. We have taken opportunities to raise our wider concerns in international fora, including in relation to Tibet. And my Lords, we remain active and resolute in calling China out on the actions to undermine Hong Kong's way of life, as all noble lords alluded to. My Lords, I'm short of time at this moment. I've already committed to consulting with colleagues across, particularly on the Department of International Trade, but I assure noble lords we have introduced new measures in the Modern Slavery Bill, which require businesses specifically and public sector bodies to report on specific areas in their modern slavery statements, including due diligence, and we have improved the application of UK export controls. To conclude, my Lords, let me assure you of our continued commitment on the issue and primary importance of human rights for all communities within China, our continuing commitment to the relationships we have with key areas, including those of Hong Kong and Taiwan. And December will mark the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that affirms the universal character of human rights, inherent, inalienable, and applicable to all human beings, and that will remain our moral compass.